This is one of those texts that convinces me that the whole thing wasn't just made up. Every once in a while you get that argument from people. Oh, way back when these guys got together and they made up this story about Jesus and all this stuff, And you get a story like this in the scripture. And if they really wanted to start something like a religion and have this wonderful figure like a Son of God, Jesus, they wouldn't have put this story in there. Nobody in their right mind would put this story in there, but they did. Mark has it in his gospel. The woman in question he calls Syrophoenician, a Greek woman. Matthew personalized it a little more and made her a Canaanite. Now that may not sound like a big deal to us now, but a Syrophoenician, a Greek from the islands, would have been a foreigner. Canaanite was an enemy. A lot of difference between those two. It all begins because the Pharisees start complaining. Why do your disciples play fast and loose with the rules? Rules are important. If you don't have rules, you have what? Chaos. If you don't have rules, you have children that prevent you from going to a restaurant, because now restaurants are saying no kids because there's no rules. When the children get up and start feeding themselves off someone else's plate on the table next to you, and the parents don't stop them, that becomes a problem. Who'd have thought? You got to have rules. But sometimes rules get in the way. Served in church where we decided to have a community. One way to get to know folks around that live around the church was to have a community yard sale. So we set it up, we did all the advertising, got it, we'll bring our stuff. We did the whole thing, got it all set up. That morning early, we're picking up tables out of the fellowship hall. We're starting out to put them in the parking lot for people to set up their stuff on. And somebody, who was the chair of the trustees, said, "You can't do that." "Oh, what's wrong?" He says, "The table, it's in the rules. The tables are not to leave the fellowship hall." And I said, "But we moved them." It was not a pretty sight. Jesus said, "Why do you use your rules to play fast and loose with God's commands?" See, that was one of those instances where the rules were preventing us from doing ministry. It was a stupid rule. Well, it wasn't a stupid rule. But it was when we broke it. God clearly said, Jesus says, "Respect your father and mother," and when denouncing father and mother should be killed. He says, "But you weasel around that." He's showing the Pharisees how they weasel around the rules and change things to their advantage. Like in Washington, or Lansing, or wherever else. You cancel God's command with your rules. Fraud, he calls them. And they don't like it. So then he says to the crowd, what we started with this morning, it's not what you swallow, it's what comes out of you that pollutes your life. The disciples are a little miffed that he upset the Pharisees. After all, they did have a lot of power, and they were helpful, and they were, after all, the keepers of the law. I've never actively encouraged my congregation to upset the police. Although there have been sometimes a little civil disobedience goes a long way in certain situations. But, generally you try not to upset the people that enforce the law. Whether it's, the law of the state or the law of the church. Most of us pastors don't really try to upset the council of bishops or the judicial council or our district superintendent. We don't go out of our way to do that. We prefer it when they're happy. Most of us are like that. Sometimes, though, we are called to do things that upset the status quo. Sometimes they're big things like peace rallies and civil rights marches, and I lived in one parsonage that only 20 years before, 20 years? That's what it was, 90, so that was in the late, in the mid-70s this happened. When a cross was burned on the parsonage lawn. Sometimes because of what God commands us to do, to love people, to insist on justice and fairness, sometimes we have to upset the apple cart. When the apple cart's headed in the wrong direction, it needs to be upset. If we are going to walk the talk, if we're going to do what we say, then sometimes it involves upsetting people. Jesus never really worried about upsetting anyone. He said what he needed to say. He did what he needed to do. And most everybody was pretty thrilled with that. And the ones that weren't probably needed not to be thrilled with that. I've always understood, even though I got a letter once from the Board of Ordained Ministry saying that my job was to make everyone happy. Have it in writing. I've always considered my job was to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. We get a little too comfortable with, hey, I'm good in this God thing. Then we need to be afflicted a little. And reminded that, maybe not. Jesus just says plain, it's what comes out of you that messes up your life. And isn't that true? I don't know about you, but there are times when I say things to my spouse or family that just really don't. And if I really thought about it, I probably wouldn't have said that. But I didn't. And often I wish, like the Steve Goodman song, I wish my life was on videotape so I could just, hit rewind and, back up and get a do-over. Because I don't care how many times you say you're sorry, when you're really messed up, there's still consequences, even if you're sorry, and you're sorry about those too, but you still got to deal with it. We all know that it's what we do, it's what we say, it's how we behave that affects the people around us. I may have wonderful, ethical, prowess in my mind, but if I don't act that way, no nobody knows. I know. Oh, I was really good. And everybody around you says, no, you weren't. And they probably have a better perception than what I think. And then after all this, Jesus, I mean, come on, guys, he says, look, it's don't be stupid. It's not whether you follow the rules, it's whether you love people. It's whether you share the love of God. It doesn't have to do with how many committees you have or, whether you showed up for worship or, it's about loving people. Focus on that and the rest will take care of itself. Got it? Yeah, so now, so they walk a little further and this woman comes out and she says, help me, and he says, go away. Huh? And she says, please, please help me. And he says, it's not right to give what's meant for the children of God and dogs. Go away. And the disciples finally grab him and say, look, she's driving us nuts. Would you do something for her? And he says, it's not right to give food to dogs. And she says, yeah, but, even dogs get the scraps off the floor. And he goes, okay, that's a good point. Here, okay, your daughter's healed. It's like, Jesus, what were you just saying? Doesn't this text strike you odd? It always has me. It's like, and I've read, every biblical commentator has to deal with this story. And some of them say, well, he was just trying to give the disciples an example of what not to do. Okay. Others say that, it really wasn't as rude as it sounds, and, the Canaanites were enemies, and really what was happening here, because before this spot in the text, Jesus only deals with Jewish people, and right after this, he goes into the Decapolis, into the Greek territories, and starts to preach to Gentiles. That really what happens here is this woman making Jesus aware of what his mission really was. Because all of a sudden he starts going to Gentiles now instead of just Jews. And so she expanded his horizons. And okay, but Jesus really didn't know what he was doing before. I don't know, I have a little hard time with that. I mean, is that the same Jesus that knew Andrew was, under the tree? It seems to me Jesus probably knew before this. Although, it's kind of an interesting coincidence how after this he starts doing a lot more with non-Jewish people. I wish I could tell you what the good explanation is. I haven't read one yet. This story is here, I think, just to kick our sensibilities sometimes. Maybe it helps us understand in some way that if we're not perfect at this doing God's will thing, that maybe it's okay. That God really never expected us to be perfect at it. And I'm not saying Jesus wasn't perfect. And I wish I knew Greek well enough to know, how that was. One writer, talking about the humor of Christ, he thinks he was teasing. Well, it's not really right to get the dogs. With a smile on his face. Which, it's hard to tell in the text, but I don't know. I think it reminds us that even the best of us sometimes get waylaid from what our rules tell us us, what those rules inside our head, like these are enemies and they shouldn't be treated with any kind of respect, that in Jesus' day, this was a woman and therefore should be disregarded point blank anyway. Although Jesus never acted that way, even though all the men around him did. Maybe it's a reminder that even at our best, sometimes we just don't walk the talk. Sometimes we get caught up in our own understandings, our own rules, our own beliefs, our own whatever, and we can't see past that to the person that's on the other side of it. We can't see past their choices, their addictions, their preferences, their politics, their religion, whatever it is, that we just can't see past to see the person that's there. Maybe sometimes it takes a little effort on their part to remind us of whose we are and what we expect of ourselves as Christians. Sometimes those reminders are good. I don't know if it's ever happened to you, but I will confess there have been times when my prejudices, my preconceived notions, my ideas about who those people are, whatever they were, got in the way. And if there's anything to be taken from this text, it's that to walk the talk, we have to at least be open enough to hear those objections, those arguments that say, I'm a real person, and I deserve to be treated as such. And really that's all God asks us to do, is to treat people like they're human beings.